Today, we're in week number 3 of our Proof of Life series, where we're taking a look at the narratives of people in the New Testament and how their story provides evidence that Jesus really did rise from the dead. We looked in week 1 at the outsiders, the women at the tomb, and at week 2, we looked at Thomas the doubter. And today, we're going to take a look at Peter the failure. Now, this lesson is perfect for those of you who have been pursuing God, but one of the things that's holding you back is maybe some of the skeletons in your closet. You're ashamed. You feel like you've failed God, or you failed the church, or you failed your parents, or you failed your spouse, or you failed yourself in your pursuit of God. And that is something that maybe is keeping you from pursuing God. Or maybe some of you are agnostic or you're atheists and you say, I don't really know if I buy in to this whole resurrection story in the first place. Well, today's lesson in Peter's story is perfect for you. See, Peter in the Bible had a bold exterior, but his faith backstory is filled with shame and failure. Peter was the guy who jumped out of a boat one time to walk toward Jesus, who was walking on the water toward them. And then he realized that he had jumped out of the boat and he was standing on the water, and in his doubt, he started to sink. Or another time, Peter's the guy who actually rebuked Jesus when Jesus said that he would eventually have to go to the cross. Peter said, no way, that should never happen. And Jesus had to rebuke Peter. Peter had a case of foot and mouth disease. Or another time when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane and some Roman soldiers came to arrest Jesus, Peter's the guy that jumped up and chopped off one of the soldiers' ears because he was so bold. He was so zealous. Yet in spite of all of this, Peter had his own sort of skeletons in the closet. He had things that he did that he was incredibly ashamed of. And probably the biggest one is found in Luke 22, when the Bible says that they arrested Jesus and they led him to the high priest's home. Peter follows at a distance, and the story says that the guards lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat around it. And Peter joined them there, and a servant girl noticed him in the firelight and began staring at him. And then finally she said, I know who you are. This man was one of Jesus's followers. But Peter denied it and said, woman, I don't even know him. And if you read on in the story, it says that Peter denied Jesus a second time. And then as you turn the page to verse 60, he denies knowing Jesus a third time. He says, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And then look at what happens. Immediately, while Peter was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And at that moment, the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and suddenly the Lord's words flashed through Peter's mind. These were words that Jesus had spoken earlier. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And look at what verse 62 says. So Peter left the courtyard weeping bitterly. And I don't know if you can relate to Peter's story. Maybe there have been times in your life, in your faith journey, where you're just ashamed of not standing up for Jesus, or you're ashamed of something that you've done in your life, or some of the things that are in your closet, some of the skeletons that you've got there. Well, this was Peter's story. I can't even imagine how Peter must have felt that night, the night that Jesus went to the cross. Peter had followed Jesus for 3 years, and he was so bold, and he was so confident, and he was the guy that would jump out and walk on the water, and now he denies Jesus 3 different times. But if you read on in the Bible, you'll see that the resurrected Christ met Peter in his shame, and he gave him a fresh start. Let's fast forward to the Gospel of John, chapter 21. This is the 3rd time that the resurrected Jesus is going to interact with Peter and some of the other disciples. It says at dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. They were out on a boat. He called out to them, fellows, have you caught any fish? They said, no. And then he said, throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat and you'll get some. So they did. And they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. And look at what happens next. This is reminiscent of an earlier story. It says, the disciple that Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic and he jumped into the water and headed to shore. The others, it says, stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore because they were only about 100 yards from the shore. Now, I love that this story is calling to mind earlier in Peter's journey with Jesus when he jumped out on the water and started walking on the water. And who knows, maybe Peter actually thought that he would be able to walk on the water to the shore, but it shows us that Peter's personality hasn't changed. He's still bold. He's still willing to jump into the water and go after Jesus. And as we read on in John 21, we see that Jesus singles out Peter and has a message for him. He says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Then feed my lambs." And if you read verse 16, Jesus repeats the same thing. And then in verse 17, he says it a third time. He said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt that Jesus had asked the question a third time. And he said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep." Now, I think it's more than coincidence that Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Because remember how many times Peter had denied Jesus? 3 different times. It's almost as if Jesus is saying, "I'm going to give you a second chance. Actually, I'm going to give you a third chance. You denied me 3 times, but here's the thing. Jesus allows us to overcome our shame. He allows us to overcome the skeletons in our closets. And even though Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus didn't hold it against him. Jesus gave him 3 chances to sort of restate his faith, and Peter does so. And that brings us to the point to this whole lesson. The rest of Peter's story is proof that Jesus really did rise from the dead and that he can turn around our most shameful failures. In fact, let's read how this interaction between Jesus and Peter ends. Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and you went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and others will dress you and take you where you do not want to go." And Jesus said this to let Peter know by what kind of death he would glorify God. And then Jesus told Peter, "Follow me." And history tells us that Peter did indeed end up giving up his life for his faith. And that's why I think Peter's story is such incredible evidence that Jesus really did rise from the dead. Because if Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, if Jesus didn't really appear to Peter after his death and resurrection, then do you think that Peter would be able to go to the cross? Do you think Peter would die for a lie? There's no way. Peter did follow Jesus for the rest of his life, and in fact, he gave up his life for Jesus. And if you turn the page to the book of Acts, you get to see Peter's very first sermon in Acts chapter 2. He steps forward with the 11 other apostles, and he shouted to the crowd his first sermon, which ended with these words, "God raised Jesus from the dead, and we are all witnesses of this." Peter really did witness the resurrected Christ, and it totally changed his life in spite of his shameful failures. And the same could be true of your life if you would give Jesus a chance.